Chicago wore its evening like a fine black coat, sleek, heavy, and stitched with the faint hum of rain. From the tall windows of her Lincoln Park townhouse, Marian Cole watched the city flicker with light, the streets glistening with a polished melancholy that only November could conjure. The scent of rosemary chicken filled the air, mingled with faint traces of the sandalwood oil she used to calm her nerves. Her dining table gleamed beneath the chandelier's silver-polished crystal glasses aligned with military precision. It had been months since she'd set the table for two. Tonight her son was coming home for dinner. At 68, Marian moved with the quiet poise of a woman who had built her empire. Her skin was the color of burnished mahogany, her hair silvered and regal. She'd once been a name whispered with awe in Chicago's real estate circles, the woman who turned bankrupt blocks into luxury skylines. But beneath that power lay a truth she never admitted aloud. Her most incredible creation was Julian. The grandfather clock struck 7. The doorbell chimed. When she opened the door, Julian Cole, 38, stood under the porch light, rain glistening on his coat. He looked older than she remembered, still handsome, but there was something haunted behind his hazel eyes. "Mom," he greeted, managing a small smile. "Come in before you catch a cold," she said, stepping aside. "You're late?" "Traffic," he replied, shaking off his coat. His tone was casual but distant, like a man already rehearsing his excuses. They sat down at the long mahogany table. For a while only, the sound of clinking silverware filled the room. The familiar ritual that had once brought comfort now felt like walking on thin ice. Marian watched him slice through his chicken without appetite. "You've lost weight," he shrugged. "Been busy." With what she asked lightly, though her pulse had begun its quiet drum. Julian hesitated, then met her eyes. "Actually, that's what I came to tell you. I'm getting married." The fork slipped from her fingers, landing with a sharp chime. "Married?" He nodded too quickly. "Her name's Sabrina Ward. She's a psychologist. We met 6 months ago." 6 months. Marian's breath caught. "That's relatively fast." Julian's shoulders stiffened. "Not everyone needs years to make up their mind, Mother. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." His voice rose slightly. "You never think anyone's good enough for me." Marian exhaled slowly, steadying her voice. "I only want you to be happy, Julian. That's all I've ever wanted." He looked away, eyes hard. "You said the same about Lydia. Remember how that turned out? Lydia, his first wife, had drained his accounts and left him for a fitness instructor. Marian had warned him then too, and been right, but victory had brought no comfort. "I learned my lesson," Julian said. "This time I'm choosing for myself. And when's the wedding march?" "In Evanston," Marian repeated softly as though the word might make it real. He poured himself a drink, his father's old Scotch brand, and leaned back. "Sabrina's incredible. You'll love her. She's brilliant, kind, thoughtful." Marian smiled faintly. "Then I look forward to meeting her. She's heard all about you," he said, his tone carrying an edge she couldn't quite read. The legendary Marian Cole, the woman who built half of downtown. Marian set down her glass. "That doesn't sound like admiration. It's respect," he replied, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. They talked about safer things after that, the real estate market, the mayor's new zoning policy, the weather that refused to choose between fall and winter. But beneath every exchange, Marian felt the widening distance. When he left that night, his kiss on her cheek was quick, perfunctory. "Good night, Mom. Good night, my son." She stood at the window, long after his car disappeared down the slick street, the taillights dimming like dying embers. The house, once warm, felt colder than she remembered. In her study, she poured herself another drink and opened her laptop. Old habits returned, the instincts of a woman who'd built fortunes by spotting cracks before they became collapses. She typed, "Sabrina Ward is a psychologist from Chicago and Stanford University." The search results were polished. Too polished. Professional headshots, generic bios, a few interviews in local publications about emotional intelligence in marriage. There are no traces of student papers or early career mentions, nothing before 5 years ago. Marian frowned. "Everyone leaves footprints," she murmured, "even ghosts." Her phone buzzed. A text from Julian. "Be nice to her, Mom. Sabrina's my future. Please don't make me choose." The words cut deeper than he could know. She had sacrificed everything for him, her youth, marriage, and friends. And now he spoke as if she were an obstacle. Marian closed her eyes and whispered to the empty room, "I already lost your father. I won't lose you either." Outside, thunder rolled over Lake Michigan, rattling the glass. Marian looked at her reflection in the window, strong, proud, but lonely. She touched the faint scar near her temple, a relic from the years she'd worked construction sites alongside her late husband. "Don't make me fight again, Lord," she murmured. "Not with my own blood." But deep down, she already knew she would. The following morning, she visited her husband's grave in Oakwood Cemetery. The sky was pale gray, the kind that promised snow but never delivered. She brushed leaves from the headstone. "Harold," she whispered. "He's marrying again." A psychologist this time. Too soon, too fast. The silence around her seemed to absorb the words. "I can feel it," she continued softly. "Something's wrong. I've spent my life reading people contracts, lies, promises. This woman, she's wearing a mask." A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a nearby chimney. Marian took it as a sign, though she didn't know what. Back home, she found an email in her inbox. Subject: Cole Holdings, Investment Proposal Inquiry. The sender's name: Sabrina Ward. Her pulse quickened as she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Cole, I hope this finds you well. Julian speaks of you often and with deep admiration. I've been reading about your career, it's truly inspiring. I'd love to meet you soon, perhaps over lunch, to discuss ideas for your company's community initiatives. Warmly, Sabrina Ward." It was polite, perfectly worded, too perfectly. Marian leaned back, staring at the screen. The email wasn't from a woman in love, it was from someone rehearsing a performance. She typed a brief reply. "Lunch sounds fine. Thursday, my office noon." Then she deleted the message thread entirely. She needed to see this woman up close. As night fell again over Lincoln Park, Marian sat alone in her living room, the city lights shimmering beyond the window, like a constellation she no longer belonged to. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the wood floors, each sound seemed to echo the same truth. Her house was too quiet, her heart too alert. The war had not yet begun, but she could smell the smoke. Share this story if you've ever felt someone slipping away from you, someone you fought your whole life to protect. Tell me in the comments, would you let them go or fight to bring them back? The morning of the wedding began with snow. Not the soft, cinematic kind, but the cold, stubborn kind that clings to roofs and refuses to melt. Chicago lay beneath a white hush, the kind that makes even the loudest city sound uncertain. From her window, Marian Cole watched the world turn pale and unfamiliar, as if nature warned her to stay home. She didn't. At 9, her driver pulled up to the townhouse, a black sedan gleaming under the gray sky. Marian stepped out in a tailored navy coat, gloves of soft leather, and a hat veiled in a thin layer of netting. There was nothing ostentatious about her appearance, just the quiet authority of a woman who knew her worth. The ceremony was held in St. Matthew's Church in Evanston, an old stone building with stained glass windows and a choir that sounded more professional than spiritual. When she entered, conversations hushed, heads turned. Mrs. Cole whispered, one woman leaning to another, "I thought she wasn't coming." "Oh, she wouldn't miss it," came the reply. "People like her never do." Marian ignored them. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble aisle as she placed herself in the front pew on the groom's side. She'd earned that seat with years of sacrifice, with love that never demanded gratitude. And then she saw Sabrina Ward. The young woman glided down the aisle, a vision of icy beauty. The gown was sleek and understated, but every inch was bespoke money. Her dark hair fell in perfect waves, a single white orchid pinned near her ear. How she smiled, small, practiced, delicate, sent a ripple of unease through Marian's chest. When Sabrina reached the altar, she didn't look nervous. She looked victorious. The ceremony was brief and efficient. The priest spoke of union trust and two souls becoming one. Marian barely heard him. Her eyes stayed on the bride's hands, steady, deliberate, clutching Julian's with a possessiveness that made something inside her twist. When it ended, applause erupted like a cue in a play. Julian turned beaming and led Sabrina down the aisle. Marian clapped because that's what was expected of her. Her smile, too, was perfectly measured. At the reception, held in the ballroom of a historic Evanston hotel, chandeliers glittered over white roses and silver cutlery. A string quartet played jazz standards. Servers in black vests moved like shadows between tables. Marian was seated at the head table beside a man she didn't know, a lawyer perhaps, or one of Julian's business acquaintances. She listened as Sabrina laughed easily, her voice smooth, her posture impeccable. Everything about her radiated polish, yet there was something off, something hollow, rehearsed. Halfway through dinner, Marian caught sight of a man standing near the bar. Tall, sharp suit, too alert to be a casual guest. He leaned towards Sabrina at one point, whispering something that made her shoulders tense. Their eyes met hers and Marian's for a split second, and the air shifted. The man turned away. "Who's that?" Marian asked the person beside her. The man glanced up. "Marcus Hale, estate lawyer, handles a lot of wealthy accounts." "Julian's lawyer, I think so. Or hers." Marian felt the pulse in her wrist quicken. She turned toward Julian, who was laughing, glass raised in a toast. His face glowed with joy that blinds people to everything else. For the rest of the evening, Marian watched silently the way Sabrina floated from guest to guest, collecting admiration like currency, and Marcus never strayed far from her orbit. By the time the cake was cut, Marian's resolve had hardened into something cold and bright. Later that night she returned home alone. The wind had picked up scattering snow against the townhouse windows. Marian hung her coat, carefully poured herself a single glass of scotch, and stood by the fire. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were not. She could still hear Sabrina's voice echoing from the toast, to new beginnings and to family by choice as much as blood. Family by choice. The phrase had landed like a knife. In the reflection of the glass, Marian saw herself strong, yes, but tired. A woman who had worked her way from the south side to the penthouses of Lincoln Park only to watch everything she built being handed to a stranger in lace. She whispered into the quiet room, "Julian, you've married a mask." A week passed, then two. Julian and Sabrina were honeymooning in Costa Rica, and the photos filling his social media feed were like postcards from another life, smiling faces, beaches, sunsets, and cocktails in hand. Every image curated perfect public. Marian didn't post anything. She didn't comment. She waited. When they returned to Chicago, she hosted a dinner, the polite, motherly thing to do. The townhouse smelled of lemon polish and roasted duck. The table glowed under candlelight. Sabrina arrived in a cream dress that cost more than most people's rent. "Mrs. Cole," she said warmly, offering a smile so flawless it might have been drawn on. "Thank you for inviting us." "Please," Marian replied. "Call me Marian." Sabrina's eyes flickered just briefly before she nodded. "Of course, Marian." The meal began pleasantly enough. Julian was relaxed, happier than Marian had seen him in years. He spoke about their trip, the rainforests, the food, and how Sabrina can charm anyone, even the locals. Marian listened, smiled, and asked the right questions, but she also observed how Sabrina's hand lingered over Julian's wrist when he spoke, guiding his words without interrupting them. The way her compliments always included herself. "Julian's learning so much from me about empathy. We've decided to simplify his schedule, less stress, more balance." Later, as she cleared the dishes, she overheard them in the living room. Sabrina's voice low measured. "She doesn't like me." Julian sighed. "She's cautious. It's not personal." "It feels personal," Sabrina said softly. "I can tell when someone sees me as a threat." Marian froze behind the doorframe. Julian's voice dropped to a murmur. "Give her time." "She might not have much left," Sabrina whispered almost tenderly. "She's not young, Julian. And the forgetfulness she mentioned at dinner, did you notice I didn't?" "I did." There was a pause. Then Sabrina added, "Maybe we should start helping with her affairs before things get complicated." Marian stood there, hand gripping the edge of the wall, her breath sharp and shallow. That night, long after they'd gone home, she opened her old filing cabinet containing her late husband's records, property deeds, and legal papers. She flipped through them one by one, reassuring herself that every document was still where it should be. But as her hand brushed against the envelope marked Will, Cole Estate, she stopped. Her reflection in the cabinet's glass was faint and distorted, but she met her gaze and said quietly, "You won't take him, and you won't take what we built." 2 days later, she visited the office of Harold Green, her former lawyer, now half-retired but as sharp as ever. "Marian," he said, rising from behind a desk piled with case files. "It's been years. I wish it were just a social call," she said, sitting down. He studied her face, frowning. "This is about your son. It's about his wife." She told him everything, the wedding, the lawyer at the reception, the tone of Sabrina's email, the conversation she overheard. Harold listened silent. When she finished, he said, "Do you have proof?" "Not yet." "Then start gathering it, quietly." Marian nodded. "I'm not losing my family again, Harold, not this time." That night back in Lincoln Park, snow began to fall again, soft this time, like forgiveness. But Marian didn't feel forgiven. She felt awake. She poured herself tea instead of whiskey, sat by the window, and opened her laptop again. She typed Marcus Hale, estate attorney, Chicago, and hit search. And just like that, a new web began to form, one of Connection's court records and whispered scandals she would soon follow, thread by thread. For now the city slept. But Marion Cole did not. The snow had melted by March, but the air over Chicago still held the gray chill of winter that refused to leave. From the bay window of her Lincoln Park townhouse, Marion Cole watched the first buds of spring tremble in the wind. Across the street, children were chasing one another through puddles. It should have been a comforting sight, but lately even laughter made her uneasy. Julian and Sabrina had moved back to Chicago 2 weeks ago into her house. At first, the idea had been presented sweetly enough. "You shouldn't live alone," Mary and Sabrina had said over tea one afternoon, her smile a masterpiece of compassion. "It'll be easier for all of us if we're under one roof." Julian had agreed, eager and unsuspecting. "I can take care of things for you, Mom. Bills, errands, appointments." "You've done enough for your whole life." It sounded generous, but it felt like someone quietly moving pieces on a board she no longer controlled to Marion. By the third week, her home had begun to change. The living room, once filled with photographs and the smell of lemon oil, now gleamed like a hotel lobby, cold, modern, and impersonal. Sabrina called it decluttering. The framed portrait of Marion and her late husband was gone, replaced by abstract art in muted grays. Family albums disappeared from the shelves. When Marion asked where they were, Sabrina smiled softly. "They're in storage, darling. Dust isn't good for old paper. You wouldn't want them ruined, would you?" Her tone was syrupy. Her eyes were steel. Marion said nothing. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous people wore politeness like perfume. Julian, meanwhile, seemed tired all the time. He complained of headaches, of feeling foggy. Sometimes he'd repeat himself without realizing it. Other times he'd forget entire conversations. "You're overworking again," Sabrina would say, brushing his hair affectionately. He'd nod obedient and swallow the pills she handed him from a white-labeled bottle. Marion noticed the bottles changed weekly, different names, same color pills. One morning she poured herself coffee and found the sugar jar missing. The kitchen looked unfamiliar. Sterile white blinds replaced the cheerful yellow curtains she'd hung years ago. When she turned, Sabrina was standing in the doorway. "Oh, I thought we'd brighten things up," she chirped. "White reflects more light, makes the room feel bigger." Marion took a long sip of coffee. "And colder," she murmured. Sabrina's smile didn't falter. "Change is good, Marion. It keeps the mind healthy." That night, Marion went upstairs to her study. She hadn't been in there for days. Sabrina had reorganized it. When she opened the door, she stopped cold. Her husband's books gone. The dark oak shelves were now half empty, the rest lined with sleek decorative pieces. The old brass lamp was missing. The air smelled faintly of new paint and chemical polish. In their place stood a single glass vase with a white orchid. Marion's voice trembled with fury. "Where are my things?" Sabrina appeared in the doorway, calm as ever. "We stored them safely, I promise. The doctor said reducing clutter helps prevent accidents. You know, tripping over furniture confusion," Marion snapped. "What doctor? I haven't seen anyone." Sabrina turned to Julian, who had followed behind her, concern furrowing his brow. "See what I mean, honey? Dr. Simmons examined her last month. She doesn't remember." Julian's expression softened with pity that sliced through Marion's heart like a knife. "Mom, please. Let us help. I don't need your help," she shouted. But her voice broke at the end, too fragile to carry her anger. Sabrina sighed softly, almost lovingly. "Denial is a part of the process." Marion stood frozen as they left the room. The quiet afterward was unbearable, heavy with the sound of her own breath, the faint hum of the heating vent. The truth she didn't want to face. They were dismantling her piece by piece. The next morning, Marion woke to find a calendar taped to the refrigerator filled with neat handwriting that wasn't hers. Medication check, doctor visit, cognitive assessment. She stared at it for a long time. When Julian came down for breakfast, his shirt wrinkled, eyes dull, she poured him coffee. "You don't look well." He smiled faintly. "Sabrina says it's stress. She's got me on vitamins now." Marion hesitated. "Do they help?" He shrugged. "Hard to tell." She looked at the cup in his hand, the faint tremor in his fingers. "Julian, has she ever told you what's in those pills?" He frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "A mother's question," she said quietly. Before he could answer, Sabrina's voice floated from the stairs. "You worry too much, Marion." Marion turned. Sabrina descended gracefully in silk pajamas and a robe that shimmered like champagne. Julian's fine. You're the one who needs rest. Marian said nothing. She was learning. Words were useless against people who weaponized them. That evening she sat in her bedroom, the only place still feeling hers, and called Renee Johnson, her closest friend and retired nurse. I think they're trying to push me out, Marian whispered. Or worse. Worse, Renee repeated. Marian, what's going on? Marian told her everything. The missing things, the pills, the talk of confusion. Renee was quiet for a long moment, then said, I believe you. I've seen cases like this, gaslighting, manipulation, sometimes even drugging. You need to keep records, dates, names, everything. Quietly. I already started, Marian said. I have a journal. Hidden. Good. And don't eat or drink anything you didn't make yourself. Marian exhaled, tension loosening for the first time in weeks. Thank you. Renee's voice softened. You're not alone, honey. Just stay sharp. Let them think you're fading. It'll make them careless. A few nights later, unable to sleep, Marian crept downstairs. The house was dark, the faint blue glow of the kitchen clock marking 2:47 a.m. She heard voices, soft, urgent, coming from Julian's office. She stopped outside the door. Sabrina's tone was low, controlled. He's signing the new documents next week. A man's voice crackled faintly from a speakerphone. Good. And the older woman? She's confused enough. I'll handle her soon. Marian's breath caught. The sound of her heartbeat filled her ears. Be careful, the man continued. We can't afford another mistake like the Boston case. I'm not worried, Sabrina said. Julian trusts me completely. Once everything's transferred, we disappear. Marian backed away silently, hand pressed to her mouth. When she reached her room, her whole body was shaking. She sat on the edge of her bed until dawn, staring at the pale light spilling through the curtains. By morning, she'd made a decision. She called Renee again. I need a name, Marian said. Someone who can help quietly. A private investigator. I know a man, Renee replied. Used to work with financial crimes. Discreet. You'll meet at my place tomorrow at 2:00. Thank you. When she hung up, Marian looked around her room. Her sanctuary had become her prison. Every sound in the hallway made her tense. Every glance from Sabrina felt like a blade. But the fear that had once paralyzed her was now transforming, sharpening into something more substantial. She had been underestimated before. That was their first mistake. 2 days later, at Renee's small apartment in Bronzeville, Marian met James Holden, a quiet man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an air of contained patience. I understand you suspect your daughter-in-law of manipulating your son, he said. And poisoning him, Marian replied evenly. He didn't blink. Do you have evidence? Not yet, but I have instincts, and they've never been wrong. James nodded slowly. Then let's start gathering proof before she realizes we're watching. Marian handed him a small list she'd written in her precise handwriting. Pills, Dr. Simmons, Marcus Hale, financial transfers. He looked up, impressed. You've already done half my job. I built an empire from nothing, Mr. Holden, she said quietly. I can build a case, too. Back in her room, Marian locked the door and pulled out her hidden laptop that night. She opened a blank folder labeled Accounts 2019 Taxes and began typing notes inside it. Every strange behavior, every inconsistency, every overheard whisper. The hum of the city drifted through the window sirens, wind a faint rumble of the train in the distance. Marian's fingers paused on the keyboard. For a moment she thought of Julian as a child, the boy who used to build forts from couch cushions, and said, When I grow up, I'll take care of you, Mom. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. I'm taking care of you now, my love, she whispered. And then she kept typing long into the night as the shadows in her house grew deeper. Chicago was waking to spring, but in the Cole household the air had grown thick and stale like a room that hadn't been opened in months. Marian Cole woke before dawn each day not out of restlessness but out of survival. It was the only time she felt the house truly belonged to her again. At 5 a.m. she would sit by the kitchen window, her notebook hidden under a pile of old magazines, and record what she'd seen the day before. Every glance, every phrase, every pill Julian swallowed under Sabrina's watchful eyes. The notebook was small, bound in worn brown leather, its pages filled with steady handwriting. March 18th. Julian seemed dizzy after dinner. Sabrina poured the wine. Each entry felt like a breath drawn in a burning room. She couldn't yet prove what was happening. But she was documenting the decay. By the end of March, James Holden had begun his quiet investigation. He was discreet, too discreet perhaps for Marian's liking. Weeks passed with little word. When he finally called, his voice was cautious. I've traced Marcus Hale. He's a lawyer, yes, but also a consultant in estate management. He worked with several wealthy clients who died under unclear circumstances. Marian's fingers tightened around the phone. And Sabrina. She has no verifiable academic record before 2016. No university transcripts. No trace of a psychology license in Illinois. Marian closed her eyes. The confirmation felt both vindicating and terrifying. She's done this before, she whispered. Possibly. I'm still digging. When she hung up, her reflection in the darkened window looked unfamiliar eyes, sharper, posture, straighter. Fear had transformed into something else, precision. One evening, she decided to test a theory. Dinner had become ritualized under Sabrina's control, wine poured by her, hand pills delivered like communion. That night, Marian joined them at the table, her demeanor calm, almost warm. You've both been so good to me, she said lightly. I don't say it enough. Julian smiled weakly. Sabrina's eyes softened in performance. We're family, she replied. We take care of each other. When Sabrina turned to fetch a bottle from the counter, Marian caught the faint metallic glint of powder dissolving into Julian's wine. Her pulse quickened, but her expression didn't change. Let's toast, Marian said suddenly. She lifted her glass and bumped into Julian's arm with a clumsy motion that looked perfectly accidental. The glasses switched in the confusion of napkins and laughter. Careful, Mother, Sabrina said sweetly, retrieving a towel. Getting old, Marian replied, smiling faintly. They drank. Hours later, Marian woke with her body aflame. Her heartbeat was erratic, pounding in her ears. The room spun in slow, nauseating circles. She reached for her phone, the world tilting around her. She pressed a single button, the emergency contact James had installed weeks earlier. When the line connected, she could barely whisper. Poison. Wine. The rest was darkness. She awoke in a hospital room, the ceiling white, the air sterile. Dr. Richard Bennett, her family physician, sat beside her bed for decades. His once black hair had gone silver, his eyes still sharp. Welcome back, he said quietly. What happened? You were poisoned, he replied. Aconitine, a plant-based toxin, very old-fashioned and very hard to detect. Her throat tightened. Julie, Dr. Bennett hesitated. Alive, but deteriorating. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Does he know? Not yet. We told him it was exhaustion. He leaned closer. James filled me in. You were right, Marian. They're trying to kill you and your son. Marian stared at the IV line feeding into her arm. Then we have to stop them. She spent 2 days in the hospital pretending frailty while her mind worked relentlessly. When she was discharged, she insisted on returning home despite Dr. Bennett's protests. I'll play the part they expect, she told him. Let her think she's won. Back at the townhouse, Sabrina greeted her with tears of relief that glistened too perfectly. Oh, thank God you're safe, she exclaimed, wrapping Marian in a careful embrace. We were so worried. Julian, pale and trembling, stood behind her. You scared us, Mom. I'm sorry, darling, Marian said softly. Sinking into her wheelchair, a prop Dr. Bennett suggested for safety and strategy, just an older woman's heart. Sabrina patted her shoulder. You must rest now. I'll handle everything. I'm sure you will, Marian murmured. That night, Marian lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight fell through the curtains, casting thin silver bars across her quilt. She could hear Sabrina's laughter from down the hall, low, intimate, not the laughter of a grieving wife. And then she heard Julian's voice, sharp and weary. What are these pills doing in your drawer, Sabrina? They aren't mine or yours. Marian sat up, every nerve alert. Sabrina's reply came after a long pause. They're samples from my research, leftovers from before we married. You know that. Julian's tone softened, confused. Right. Right. His footsteps receded, slow and unsteady. Marian closed her eyes, fists clenched under the blanket. For the first time, a crack had appeared in Sabrina's mask. The following morning, Renee came by under the guise of checking on her old friend. She brought flowers in a small paper bag. Inside was a compact recording device disguised as a brooch. Press this once to start, she whispered. Keep it close. It records everything within 20 feet. Marian nodded, pinning it to her sweater. I'm done waiting. James Holden arrived at Dr. Bennett's office 2 days later with a manila folder. Inside were photos, grainy but damning. Sabrina and Marcus Hale are meeting at a motel on the edge of town. Sabrina laughing, her hand on his chest. Receipts for offshore transfers. a fake Stanford diploma printed in California. She's not even who she says she is, James said grimly. Marion studied the photos. We'll need more. I want her words, then let her talk, James said. Make her believe she's untouchable. Marion smiled a thin, dangerous curve. That won't be hard. That evening she wheeled herself into the living room, where Sabrina sorted documents. Such dedication, Marion said. Sabrina looked up, startled. Oh, Marion, you should be resting. Rest is overrated. Thank you for taking care of Julian and everything. Sabrina's smile returned, polished and professional. He's my husband. His well-being is my priority. And the business? The properties. Her gaze flickered. Of course, I only want what's best for the family. Simplifying management will make things easier for everyone. Marion leaned forward slightly. You sound like someone who's thought this through. Sabrina chuckled softly. You could say that. The brooch at Marion's chest blinked once recording. Hours later, Marion replayed the audio with James and Renee. The clarity was perfect, Sabrina's voice, calm, confident, discussing transitioning assets and moving forward before health complicates legal ownership. James exhaled slowly. That's enough to open a case. Renee squeezed Marion's hand. You're almost there, honey. Marion nodded, but her face was unreadable. Almost. But I want her caught, not cornered. The next day, Sabrina made her move. She came into Marion's room mid-morning holding a set of papers. I've spoken with the family lawyer, she said. He thinks it's best if we appoint me as your medical proxy just in case of emergencies. Marion met her eyes. In case of another poisoning, you mean? Sabrina froze. What? Marion smiled faintly. Nothing, dear. My mind wanders these days. Sabrina's expression softened again, but her hands trembled slightly as she handed over the pen. Marion didn't sign. She looked up and said quietly, You must be tired, Sabrina, keeping track of all the lies. Something flickered behind Sabrina's eyes, a shadow quick and sharp. Then she laughed, brittle and bright. You should rest. When she left the room, Marion whispered into the empty air, You first. That night the rain returned, cold and sudden, drumming against the windows like warning knocks. Marion sat awake, her brooch glowing faintly in the dark, capturing the sound of footsteps moving outside her door. And when she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed not of her husband or son, but of a serpent coiled quietly beneath the floorboards, patient, waiting for its next breath of silence. The morning it happened, the sky over Chicago was a dull, merciless gray. Like a clock marking the inevitable, a thin drizzle tapped against the windows. Marion Cole woke to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the sort that presses on your chest, that feels like the house is holding its breath. Julian had not come home the previous night. He'd told her at dinner that he had a late meeting with investors. Sabrina, of course, had smiled reassuringly and said, He'll be fine, Marion. He needs rest. But something in her voice had been wrong, too soft, too calm, like a curtain drawn over a crime. At 6 in the morning, Marion heard footsteps in the hall, fast, uneven. She sat up, heart pounding. The door burst open. It was Renee, her coat soaked through. Marion, she gasped. I'm so sorry, you need to come with me. Now. They reached the hospital within minutes. The corridors were bright and sterile, filled with the distant beep of monitors and the whisper of nurses' shoes. Marion's knees trembled as they entered the ICU. A doctor met them at the door. His expression told her everything. Mrs. Cole, he said gently, your son was found unconscious at home early this morning. We did everything we could. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry. The word fell like glass shattering. She moved toward the room in slow disbelief. Through the glass partition, she saw Julian, her boy, her pride, her last reason to wake each morning, lying motionless beneath a thin white sheet. His face was calm, too calm. The life had been drained from him like light from a dying candle. Marion pressed her hand against the glass. Julian, she whispered, you promised you'd take care of me. Behind her, Sabrina's voice drifted like perfume. He was under so much stress, she murmured. I told him to see a doctor, but he refused. Marion turned. Sabrina stood in a black coat, her face pale but composed eyes glistening just enough for sympathy. You did this, Marion said quietly. Sabrina flinched. How dare you? Renee stepped forward, gripping Marion's arm. Not here. But Marion's voice had already sharpened. You poisoned him just like you tried with me. Sabrina's lips parted, then pressed shut. Her gaze darted to the people around them, nurses, a security guard. The performance returned instantly. "She's confused," she said softly. "Please, someone take her home." That afternoon, the hospital called it a cardiac arrest. The coroner called it natural causes. But Marion knew better. She spent hours sitting in Julian's empty room, her fingers tracing the lines of his handwriting on a notepad near the bed. Numbers, lists, a few dates. At the bottom, 2 words: "Don't trust her." Her throat tightened. She folded the page carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. When she stepped outside, the air bit at her cheeks, the drizzle turning into sleet. Across the parking lot, Sabrina was speaking with a man near a black sedan. The man's face was shadowed, but Marion recognized the stance, the expensive suit Marcus Hale. They spoke briefly. Then Sabrina smiled, touched his arm, and walked away. Marion stayed in the car for a long time, staring at the blurred taillights through the rain until her reflection stared back, older, colder, steadier. The funeral came 3 days later. It was held at St. Matthew's, the same church where they had married barely months before. The symmetry was cruel. The same aisle, the same stained glass, the same organ. Only now the music was dirges instead of wedding hymns. Sabrina had planned everything: black orchids instead of lilies, a mahogany coffin instead of oak, a photo of Julian smiling in a frame that looked too polished for grief. When Marion arrived, whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's her, the mother. She looks so fragile. I heard she's not well." She ignored them, walking with Renee at her side. At the front pew, Sabrina was already seated, veiled in black lace. Her shoulders trembled just enough to seem human. Marion sat down beside her. "You always did love control," she murmured. Sabrina didn't turn. "This is neither the time nor the place." Then when would it be? Sabrina's lips curved slightly. "When you finally realize that no one believes you." Marion looked at her, the fury inside a steady flame. "You're wrong. Someone does." And in her coat pocket, the tiny recorder brooch lay hidden, its light blinking red. After the service, the mourners filed out into the cold. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered about the tragic widow. Sabrina played her role flawlessly: tears, gratitude, dignity. Marion stood by the grave as the first shovelfuls of dirt fell. The sound was hollow, final. Renee placed a hand on her back. "He's at peace now." "No," Marion said. "He's waiting." That evening, she and James met at his office. The blinds were drawn. The only light came from a single desk lamp. "She's moving fast," James said, spreading documents across the table. "Julian's accounts, real estate holdings, and company shares are all shifting under her name." Marion stared at the papers. "She doesn't even wait for the body to cool." "She's overconfident," James replied. "That's when people make mistakes." He pulled out a flash drive. "Your recording caught her saying she simplified everything after his passing. That phrase is enough to question motive, at least." Marion nodded. "We need proof of the poison." Dr. Bennett entered then, still in his white coat, fatigue etched into his face. He placed a small envelope on the table. "Blood analysis from Julian's sample," he said quietly. "You were right. Aconitine again." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marion exhaled. "We have her." But Sabrina was ahead of them. The next morning, she appeared on local news, sitting across from a sympathetic anchor. The headline read, "Wife of Deceased Businessman Speaks on Tragedy and Mental Health Awareness." On screen, Sabrina's voice quivered just right. "Julian was under immense pressure," she said tearfully. "He tried so hard to live up to expectations. I only wish his mother had understood how much he was struggling." Marion watched from her living room, fury boiling beneath her skin. The woman had turned her son's death into a performance and a weapon. That night, the townhouse was unbearably quiet. Marion walked through the halls, touching the walls as if to steady herself. She paused by Julian's old room. His scent still lingered faintly, soap cedar, the faint tang of cologne. She sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "They think you're gone, but you're still here, aren't you?" Outside, thunder rolled over the city. She noticed something she hadn't before on the desk, a small flash drive half hidden under a stack of papers. Julian's handwriting on a sticky note beside it read, "For Mom." Her heart clenched. She plugged it into her laptop. The screen flickered. A single folder appeared: Financial Records, Sabrina Ward. Inside were PDFs, bank statements, scanned signatures, evidence of transactions between Sabrina and Marcus Hale dating back 6 months. Offshore accounts, transfers labeled consulting fees. Marion's breath caught. "Oh, my boy," she whispered. "You knew." At dawn, she called James and Renee. They arrived within the hour. The three sat silently, the flash drive on the table between them. "This," James said finally, "is more than enough for the police." Marion looked at the device, her fingers trembling. "Not yet. Not until the right moment." Renee frowned. "What are you waiting for? For her to believe she's untouchable," Marion said. "Then we end it publicly." She looked out the window where the city began to wake, the sky bleeding from gray into pale gold. Sabrina was probably smiling somewhere beyond the glass, thinking she'd won. Marion's lips tightened. Let her smile. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. April in Chicago came like a false promise, soft rain, blooming magnolias, a fragile warmth that never lasted. But inside Marion Cole's townhouse, the air was frozen with calculation. Every hour, every breath felt like the tightening of a clockwork plan. Julian's funeral had passed, but the storm he left behind was only beginning to rise. Now, legally, Mrs. Cole, Sabrina Ward, had wasted no time establishing her power. She'd called meetings, signed documents, and delivered grief like a performance polished to perfection. And tomorrow the will would be read. That evening, Marion sat in her study, restored to her control, though the walls still carried ghosts. The curtains were drawn. A single brass lamp illuminated the desk. Across from her sat James Holden and Dr. Richard Bennett. Beside them, Renee was quietly typing notes on her tablet. "The police are circling," James said, "but Sabrina still has allies. The lawyer handling the estate, Preston Chambers, worked with her before her marriage. If she forged documents, he might have helped. She's confident because she believes everyone's bought," Renee added. Marion's eyes didn't leave the window. "That's why we'll let her think so. She wants a stage, I'll give her one." Dr. Bennett hesitated. "You're still weak, Marion. Don't push too hard. Let the law handle it." She turned to him, her voice calm but unyielding. "The law doesn't punish women like her, Richard. It sympathizes with them, the grieving widow, the gentle caretaker." Her fingers brushed the edge of Julian's photo on the desk. "I built this family name. I'll decide how it ends." The next morning dawned pale and cold. The reading of the will was held downtown in a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. The conference room was elegant, marble floor, steel trim, and a view that made even grief seem expensive. Sabrina arrived precisely on time. She wore a red dress beneath a black coat, bold, inappropriate, deliberate. Red was for power. Red was for victory. When she entered, all conversation paused. "Mrs. Cole," the lawyer said, rising politely. Sabrina smiled. "Mrs. Ward Cole, actually. But please call me Sabrina." Marion entered moments later, supported by Renee. Her black suit was severe, her silver hair pinned neatly. Though frail in form, she moved with the quiet command of a woman who had rebuilt herself from ruins before. Sabrina's smile faltered for a second. Marion greeted honey, dripping over venom. Sabrina Marion replied evenly, "You look radiant. Morning suits you." The lawyer cleared his throat. "If we may begin." The reading was brief and brutal. The entirety of Julian Cole's estate, personal and corporate holdings, real property and financial assets, is hereby transferred to his wife, Sabrina Ward Cole, with full legal authority. A rustle went through the room. "A monthly allowance shall be provided to Marion Cole for her life, sufficient for her care and maintenance." Marion's lips curved faintly. Maintenance, as though she were an old clock to be wound once a month. Sabrina maintained her composure, hands folded gracefully. Then came the final note. "This will supersede all previous testaments executed 3 weeks before Mr. Cole's passing." James leaned forward. 3 weeks, Marion's tone was measured. That's when he could barely stand without help. Sabrina turned, voice cool. Julian was lucid. "I was with him." "I'm sure you were," Marion said softly. The lawyer hesitated. "There's one final item." He pulled out a sealed envelope. "A letter addressed to you, Mrs. Cole, Sr." Sabrina's head snapped up. To her, it was left under explicit instruction to be delivered privately. Marion reached forward, her hand steady. "Thank you, Mr. Chambers." She slipped the letter into her bag without opening it. Sabrina's eyes followed it like a predator watching a closing door. When the meeting adjourned, Marion stood slowly. "Thank you for your professionalism." As she passed Sabrina, she added quietly, "I hope your dress doesn't stain easily. Red hides blood, but not guilt." Sabrina's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Back at the townhouse, Marian locked herself in her room before opening the envelope. Julian's handwriting covered the first page, steady, familiar, heartbreakingly alive. Mother, if you're reading this, I fear I realized what's happening too late. I've begun forgetting things I shouldn't: signatures, meetings, even names. Sabrina insists it's stress, but I've found pills in her drawer that aren't prescribed. I've sent samples for independent testing under an alias. If anything happens to me, contact Samuel Green and he will have the results. You were right, Mother. Always. Forgive me for doubting you. Julian. Marian pressed the letter to her chest. For the first time since his death, she wept not out of weakness but relief. Her son had seen the truth. Samuel Green, she whispered. The name burned like a spark in the dark. That evening, James traced the name. He's an old employee of your husband's construction division, retired, lives in Evanston. Then we go tonight, Marian said. James frowned. Marian. She killed my son. We're done waiting. They arrived after sunset. Samuel's small house sat at the end of a quiet street porch, light glowing faintly. He opened the door at once as though expecting them. Mrs. Cole, he said, his voice trembling. I've been waiting for you. Inside the house smelled of wood polish and dust. He led them to a small table, pulling out a locked tin box. Julian came by a few days before. His voice caught. He said if something happened, you'd come. He slid the box across. Inside were vials labeled hair and blood and a manila envelope stamped from a private lab. Dr. Bennett unfolded the report. His face went pale. Aconitine again. But this time it was mixed with beta blockers to mimic heart failure. Marian closed her eyes. The proof was complete. Samuel wiped his eyes. He said he wanted you to finish what he couldn't. Marian reached across and clasped his hand. I will. 2 days later, the Chicago Tribune ran a headline, Cole family faces estate controversy amid allegations of fraud. It was only the beginning. James had discreetly passed information to a federal contact. The FBI opened a preliminary investigation. Sabrina's world began to crack quietly, invisibly. But publicly, she remained the grieving widow. She hosted a charity gala in Julian's honor, draped in that same defiant red. Marian attended. Her entrance drew every camera. Dressed in a sleek black gown, pearls at her throat, she looked like both queen and ghost. Sabrina approached, her smile razor sharp. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wouldn't miss it, Marian replied. Julian always loved a good show. Let's not cause a scene. Oh, I don't cause scenes, Marian said softly. I end them. The orchestra played. Glasses clinked, photographers circled. And beneath the glitter, 2 women stood, one cloaked in lies, the other armed with truth. When Marian returned home that night, she placed Julian's letter in her study drawer beside the evidence files. Her reflection in the glass looked older, yes, but also harder, brighter. She whispered, they called it a will reading. But this isn't about inheritance, it's about justice. And outside, the magnolias bent under the wind, their petals falling like pale confessions across the lawn. It had been 3 weeks since the reading of Julian's will, and the spring sun now hung heavy over Chicago, pouring gold onto a city that no longer felt alive to Marian Cole. She spent her mornings in silence, sipping bitter coffee while listening to the sounds of life beyond her windows, children on their way to school buses groaning at stoplights, the world continuing as if her son's death were merely a line in yesterday's paper. But inside her, something else was growing, a determination sharper than grief, colder than anger. Sabrina Ward Cole had just announced the launch of the Julian Cole Foundation, a charitable organization supporting youth entrepreneurship. It was to be unveiled with a press event and gala dinner at the Cole Mansion, the very house Sabrina had nearly stolen. To the public, it was a noble act of mourning. To Marian, it was the final insult. She wasn't just erasing Julian's memory, she was rewriting it. Everything's ready, James Holden said as he spread documents across the oak table in Marian's study. The FBI's surveillance team will be positioned throughout the event. They'll move in when she makes a transfer or mentions an offshore account. Renee leaned forward. And you're sure she'll take the bait? James smiled faintly. People like her always do. Pride is their poison. Marian glanced at Julian's framed photo by the fireplace. She's been performing for months, she said quietly. Tomorrow the performance ends. That night, Marian barely slept. She sat in her son's old chair, the glow of her desk lamp flickering across the letter he'd left her. His words had become her armor. She whispered them aloud. "You were right, Mother. Always." Outside, a storm rolled over Lake Michigan, thunder growling in the distance. Marian closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the sound fill her chest. Tomorrow she would face the woman who destroyed her son, and she would not tremble. The following evening, the Cole mansion came alive with light and noise. Chandeliers blazed over marble floors. Music hummed low beneath the chatter of Chicago's wealthy elite. Sabrina had spared no expense. She glided through the crowd in a gown of crimson silk, every inch the grieving yet powerful widow. Her diamond earrings flashed like tiny blades whenever she turned her head. "Mrs. Ward Cole," one reporter called. "What inspired this foundation?" Sabrina's voice quivered beautifully. "Julian always believed in giving back. This foundation ensures his legacy continues." Applause rippled. Cameras clicked. Every lie was perfectly rehearsed. And at the top of the grand staircase, Marian watched it all unfold. She had chosen her attire carefully, a black gown, simple yet regal pearls at her throat, silver hair swept into a clean bun. She looked like a woman carved from resolve itself. Renee joined her. "You're ready?" Marian nodded once. "Let's begin." At exactly 7:30, the presentation began. Sabrina took the stage surrounded by projected images of Julian smiling beside construction sites, children, and award ceremonies. Each photograph was carefully selected to paint her as the keeper of his dream. She said into the microphone tonight that we celebrate not loss, but legacy. The Julian Cole Foundation will bring hope to countless lives. Her voice wavered perfectly on the word hope. The audience rose in polite applause. Sabrina gestured toward the side of the stage. And now Julian's mother, Mrs. Marian Cole, would like to say a few words. It was a courtesy for the fragile older woman to express gratitude and sit back down. But Marian didn't move like someone fragile. She descended the staircase slowly, deliberately, each step echoing against the marble floor, until the entire room fell silent. She reached the podium, her hands steady on the microphone. "My son," she began softly, "was a builder not just of buildings, but of trust, decency, and integrity. Those are foundations stronger than concrete." Sabrina smiled from the front row, mask firmly in place. Marian's tone sharpened. "But those foundations can crumble when lies are poured into them." A ripple of confusion swept through the audience. Cameras tilted upward. Marian turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the glittering crowd. "My son did not die of heart failure. He was poisoned. And the woman who stands before you using his name for her own gain is responsible." Gasps. A murmur of disbelief. Someone dropped a glass. Sabrina shot to her feet, her face draining of color. "Marian, please," she's confused. Grief has Marian pressed a button on her phone. The massive screens behind her flickered. First came photographs Sabrina and Marcus Hale at a motel, their arms entwined. Then came bank records, offshore transfers, false identities, marriage certificates from 2 other states, each linked to older men who had died of heart failure. Finally, an audio clip filled the room. Sabrina's voice was calm and calculating. "We'll move everything before she realizes what's happening. Once the will's secure, she'll be irrelevant." The audience erupted. Sabrina lunged for the stage, but men in dark suits stepped from the crowd before she could reach Marian. "FBI." Sabrina Ward Cole, one agent said, his voice firm. "You are under arrest for the murder of Julian Cole and for multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy." She froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "No, this isn't real." As they cuffed her hands, she turned to Marian. "You think this makes you strong? You've lost everything too." Marian's gaze was steady, her voice quiet but unbreakable. "No, I've just stopped pretending." Hours later, the mansion was empty again except for Marian. She stood in the ballroom where the chandeliers now hung still, their light dimming into silence. Renee entered softly. "It's over." "No," Marian said. "It's just beginning." On the floor near the podium lay one of Sabrina's dropped earrings, its diamond cracked down the center. Marian picked it up and placed it in her palm. "All that glitters," she whispered, "was never gold." She closed her hand around it tightly, then walked upstairs to Julian's old room. The air there was softer, quieter. She sat on the bed and looked out over the lake. The city lights shimmered on the water like tears that refused to fall. For the first time in months, she felt her body unclench. Justice didn't bring peace, but it brought truth, which was enough for now. In the corner of the room, a photo of Julian smiled back at her, the same smile from the gala slideshow, only now stripped of lies. Marian whispered, I did it, my boy. I kept the promise you never had the chance to make. Summer arrived in Chicago with a heat that clung to the air like guilt. The newspapers had turned the Cole case into a spectacle. Every headline, every talk show, every podcast whispered the same name, Sabrina Ward Cole. To the world, she was the glamorous widow-turned-murderer. To Marion Cole, she was the shadow that still lived in her son's empty room. It had been nearly 2 months since the gala. Sabrina's arrest had set off a legal storm, but real trials moved slowly. The city's attention began to drift. The world's hunger for scandal faded faster than justice could work. But Marion didn't fade. She watched. She waited. She prepared. Every morning she sat at the oak desk in her study, reading the court filings James sent her. Her fingers traced the lines of testimony, the legal jargon, the layers of lies that Sabrina's defense had spun like silk. My client had no motive. The late Mr. Cole was under emotional distress. There is no direct evidence linking my client to the substance in question. Marion could almost hear the oily voice of Sabrina's lawyer through the text. She looked out the window toward the lake, whispering, "You trained her too well, Julian. You taught her how to speak to people. You gave her the tools, and she turned them into knives." One afternoon, James Holden arrived with Renee and Dr. Bennett. They found Marion sitting in her usual chair, tea untouched. James said the trial would start next week. They're going to argue that Julian took his own life. Marion's eyes snapped up. What Sabrina's claiming he was overwhelmed. The pressure of his company and marriage caused a breakdown. Renee clenched her fists. "She's turning him into the villain now," James sighed. "It's a classic move. Paint the dead as unstable, the widow as tragic." Marion's voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. "No, my son wasn't unstable. He was frightened, but of her. I have his letter, his recordings. Isn't that enough?" Dr. Bennett shook his head. "Letters can be challenged. Audio can be questioned. We need physical proof, something that can't be explained away." Marion stood slowly, her spine straight as a ruler. "Then we find it." The trial opened on a Monday morning, thick with humidity. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions into the damp air. Marion arrived in a black dress and a thin white scarf, her chin held high. She ignored the flashes, the murmurs, the pity. Inside the courtroom buzzed. Sabrina sat at the defense table in a tailored gray suit, her hair tied back, makeup subdued. She looked smaller now, thinner, paler, but her eyes still held that calculated glint which could draw sympathy or strike fear depending on who was watching. When she saw Marion, her lips twitched into something that was not quite a smile. The prosecutor began with precision. He presented the toxicology report, aconitine, a rare poison. He displayed Julian's medical history showing no prior cardiac illness. He played the audio of Sabrina's voice. "Once the will's secure, she'll be irrelevant." Gasps filled the room. Sabrina sat motionless, eyes glistening. When her turn came, she dabbed them delicately with a white handkerchief. "Those recordings," she said softly, "were manipulated. Julian was unstable. He thought everyone was against him, even me." Her lawyer nodded solemnly, a tragedy of paranoia. Mrs. Ward Cole loved her husband deeply. That love was misunderstood. Marion felt bile rise in her throat. She stood outside on the courthouse steps during recess, watching the crowd. Reporters swarmed like flies. Some shouted Mrs. Cole. "Is it true your son had mental health issues?" She stopped walking, turned to face them, and said quietly, "My son didn't die because he was broken. He died because he trusted the wrong person." Then she walked away, her heels striking the pavement like punctuation marks. That night she sat alone in her living room. The city hummed outside, indifferent. A folder lay on the table before her, one James hadn't seen yet. Inside were Julian's old financial records, contracts, and handwritten notes. As she flipped through, one detail caught her eye. A storage rental is paid monthly and was last accessed 2 days before his death. Her breath caught. He left something. She called James immediately. The next morning they drove to the warehouse, a long, low building on the city's outskirts. Dust and disuse clung to the air. Unit 214. The lock was old but easy to cut. Inside, the light from the doorway sliced across boxes labeled projects, blueprints, and personal. Marion's hands shook as she opened one marked Private, JC. Inside lay a small leather-bound notebook and a sealed glass vial half filled with cloudy liquid. James's voice was hushed. "What is this, doctor?" Bennett examined the vial. "If this is what I think it is." He stopped mid-sentence, pulling out a portable testing strip. The color turned crimson. Aconitine, he whispered. Unmixed. Pure. Marian felt the air leave her lungs. Julian hadn't just suspected her, he'd found the source. At the bottom of the box, folded neatly, was a handwritten document. If anything happens to me, give this to my mother. She'll know what to do. Beneath it, photocopies of invoices from a pharmaceutical supplier, all signed under Sabrina Ward's maiden name. James stared. This will end her. Marian nodded slowly. No, this will free him. 2 days later, the evidence was submitted to the prosecution. The trial's tone shifted instantly. The defense faltered. Sabrina's lawyer tried to suppress the new findings, but the judge allowed them in. Sabrina's face turned gray when the vial and documents were presented in court. Her hand gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. Mrs. Ward Cole, the prosecutor said evenly, "Can you explain why your name appears on these orders?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came. For the first time since the trial began, the mask cracked. The jury watched silently as she looked around the courtroom, realizing the performance was over. Her lawyer tried to object, but she whispered something too faint to hear and sat back down. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the sound of inevitability. Sabrina didn't cry this time. She turned her head toward Marian, her eyes hollow. Marian met her gaze. There was no triumph, only exhaustion. When the judge's gavel struck wood, Marian closed her eyes. The sound was like the door of a tomb sealing shut. Outside, the city baked in the afternoon heat. Reporters called her name, microphones thrust forward, questions flying. But Marian said nothing. She kept walking until she reached the courthouse steps, where the first raindrops began to fall, cool, sudden cleansing. For the first time in months, she felt the weight on her chest ease, even if only slightly. Behind her, the courthouse loomed a monument, not just to justice, but to the silence that follows it. She whispered almost to herself, "Rest now, Julian. The truth is louder than any lie." And she walked away into the rain. Autumn crept back into Chicago like a memory that refused to die. The leaves along the sidewalks of Lincoln Park turned brittle and gold, falling in slow spirals that brushed against Marian Cole's boots as she walked. It had been 3 months since the trial. 3 months since Sabrina Ward Cole had been led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her eyes hollow, her silence louder than any confession. To the world, the case was over. To Marian, it wasn't. Justice had spoken, but justice was not the same as peace. She realized peace was something else entirely quieter, more fragile, and more complex to earn than any verdict. The Cole mansion stood empty now, sealed and silent. Reporters had long since moved on. The city's gossip had shifted to newer scandals. But to Marian, the house still breathed each creak of the wooden stairs, and gust rattling a window pane echoed what had been lost. One evening she unlocked the front door. Dust danced in the slanted light, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and ghosts. Her heels echoed on the marble floor. The portrait still hung on the walls, Julian in his graduation gown, her late husband beside a yacht, and one of the three together, taken the day before everything began to crack. She reached out and touched the frame, her fingers trembling. "You were supposed to outlive me," she whispered to Julian's painted smile. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her older, thinner, the lines around her eyes carved by grief and resolve in equal measure. Later that week, James Holden stopped by. He found her in the garden, pruning roses that had survived the summer. "You shouldn't be doing that alone," he said gently. "I've been alone longer than you think," Marian replied. He hesitated. "The papers are calling you the woman who brought justice. They want an interview. You could tell your side, how you uncovered everything." Marian shook her head. "The story isn't about me, James. It's about what I couldn't protect." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Sometimes telling the story is a way to protect what's left." Marian didn't answer. She clipped another rose thorns, catching her gloves. "I don't need the world's sympathy. I want my house to stop feeling like a tomb." That night she walked through the rooms one by one, the study, the dining room, the old nursery Julian once painted blue when he was 17, insisting it would one day be for his future. Every room told a story, and every story ended too soon. She paused by the door to Julian's room in the upstairs hallway. She had kept it close for months, unable to bear the stillness inside. But tonight she turned the handle. The room smelled faintly of him cedarwood cologne and paper. The bed was neatly made, and the desk was still covered in notes. On the bookshelf between thick business manuals and framed certificates sat something she hadn't noticed before, a small, weathered cassette tape labeled in Julian's handwriting for Mom Final Draft. Marian stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. Downstairs, she found her old cassette player in a drawer and pressed play. Julian's voice filled the room, warm, clear, alive. "If you hear this, Mom, it means I didn't make it. Don't cry. I'm not saying that to comfort you. I mean it. Don't waste what's left of you on guilt. I kept thinking I could fix her. I thought love could do that. You always told me love was a kind of work, not magic. I didn't listen. I kept working until I broke. I'm sorry for doubting you. I need you to know I died knowing you were right. That's not regret. That's peace." Her breath hitched. She pressed her fist to her mouth, tears running freely now. The tape hissed softly before continuing. "There's one more thing. My desk drawer has a folder marked Harbor Project. It's everything you need to know about what's next for the company. Don't let them bury it. Don't let my name end with her." Then silence. A few seconds of static, then a final whisper so soft she almost missed it. "I love you, Mom." Marian sat frozen, the sound still vibrating in her chest. She let the tape end the silence afterward deeper than any prayer. The next day, she returned to Julian's desk. In the bottom drawer, she found the folder exactly where he said it would be: blueprints, feasibility studies, notes written in his careful hand. At the very back, a letter addressed, "To whoever continues my work, build it with conscience, not ambition." Marian smiled faintly through her tears. Always the engineer, even in death. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into work. With James's help, she restructured Julian's company, redirecting its profits into community housing and scholarships. The Harbor Project, she renamed it after the folder Julian left behind. It wasn't about rebuilding wealth, it was about rebuilding purpose. Renee visited often, bringing coffee and paperwork. "You're becoming a force again," she said. Marian smiled faintly. "Maybe I never stopped." But some nights when the house grew too quiet, Marian would wake suddenly convinced she heard footsteps in the hall, a slow, familiar rhythm she knew by heart. She would sit up, heart pounding, whispering into the darkness. "Is that you, Julian?" There would be no answer. Only the wind through the open window and the floorboards creak settled into memory. In October, she visited the prison. She told no one. The guards led her through narrow corridors until she reached a small visitation room divided by glass. Sabrina sat on the other side, pale and thinner, her once perfect hair dull and limp. Her hands were cuffed, her eyes, those calculating eyes, looked drained of everything except exhaustion. When she saw Marian, she gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I'd like to know if you'd come." Marian sat down. "You don't deserve to wonder about anything." Sabrina nodded slowly. "Fair. But I wanted to tell you, I didn't mean for him to die that night." "Don't lie," Marian said evenly. "I'm not lying," Sabrina whispered. "I just wanted control, not blood." But the line between them blurred. "And when it happened, I didn't stop it." Marian looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't just kill him, Sabrina. You killed the best parts of yourself long before that." Sabrina's eyes filled with tears. "You're right," she said softly. "And that's the part that keeps me alive, to suffer it." Marian stood. "Then suffer well." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "He forgave you, you know." Sabrina looked up sharply. "How could he?" "Because he loved wrong," Marian said. "And love, real love, doesn't end cleanly." She walked away, her steps echoing down the sterile corridor. That evening, back at home, the wind carried the scent of rain through the open window. The lake shimmered like molten glass in the distance. Marian sat by the fire, holding Julian's cassette in her hand. She didn't play it again. She didn't need to. His voice lived somewhere deeper now, woven into the quiet, into the spaces between her heartbeats. The last leaves fell outside, brushing against the windows like fading whispers. And for the first time since it all began, the house no longer sounded like a tomb. It sounded like memory, alive, unfinished, and eternal. Winter came quietly that year. Snow fell slowly, deliberately spiraling over Chicago, muffling the city in white. Marian Cole felt the world move without resistance for the first time in years. The noise had gone. The headlines had faded. The Cole mansion, once a house of shadows, now breathed in peace, still grand but softened by forgiveness. It had been 6 months since Sabrina Ward Cole's sentencing. She was serving a 30-year term in a federal prison in Minnesota. Occasionally, letters arrived from journalists, lawyers, even strangers, people asking Marion to retell the story that had shocked the country. She never replied. The story belonged to the dead, not the living. Her days had become steady, shaped by quiet rituals, early walks through Lincoln Park, tea at 9, meetings at the Harbor Foundation office at noon. And in the afternoons, when the light slanted through the tall windows of her study, she would sit by the fire with her journal, not to record the past, but to imagine what might still grow from it. One afternoon, she received a call from Renee. The city approved it. Renee said, her voice bright with relief. The Harbor Homes Project, they're breaking ground next week. Affordable housing right by the lakeside. Just like Julian planned. Marion closed her eyes, her throat tightening. He would have liked that, she said softly. No, he would have insisted on it. Renee laughed. He was stubborn, just like his mother. God help the world, Marion murmured, smiling faintly. Later that evening, snow still drifting against the window panes, Marion walked to the far end of the house, to Julian's study, now transformed into something new. The room had been repainted in a warm cream shade. His desk remained, but the space was different, half memorial, half living archive. Shelves of books on architecture and engineering stood beside framed photographs of families who had received homes through the foundation. On the center wall hung a single inscription on bronze: "Legacy is not what we leave behind. It's what we build that keeps others standing." Marion ran her fingers over the words. "You'd have rolled your eyes at that, wouldn't you?" she whispered. Too sentimental for an engineer. But she smiled. A few weeks later, she attended the groundbreaking ceremony. The day was crisp, the lake glinting like glass beneath the winter sun. Reporters gathered, cameras flashing. But this time, the attention no longer felt invasive. Renee stood at the podium, introducing the project, her voice steady. Then she turned toward the audience. She said that there's someone here without whom none of this would exist. A woman who refused to let grief destroy what love had built. Mrs. Marion Cole. Applause rose. Marion stepped forward, her coat buttoned tight against the cold snowflakes catching in her silver hair. She looked out at the crowd: construction workers, city officials, young families, and saw for the first time something that resembled renewal. She took a breath. "My son believed that homes aren't made of walls," she began. "They're made of people, of care, safety, and second chances." That belief cost him his life, but it also gave it meaning. So today we build again, not for him, but through him. The wind lifted her words, carrying them across the site. When the first shovel of earth was turned, Marion felt a warmth spread through her chest that was not grief, not pride, something quieter. Acceptance. In the months that followed, the harbor project grew. Foundations were laid. Streets took shape. Families moved into the first row of houses: single mothers, veterans, teachers, retirees. Every brick and window bore Julian's name, somewhere within its blueprints. Marion visited often. The residents would greet her warmly, offering coffee or homemade cookies. Children called her Ms. Cole and showed her the drawings they'd made of their new homes. One little girl, dark-skinned with bright braids and eyes too wise for her age, tugged on Marion's sleeve one afternoon. "My mom says you're the lady who gave us this house. Is that true?" Marion knelt to her level, smiling. "No, sweetheart. I just kept the promise someone else made." The girl frowned thoughtfully, then nodded. "That's still nice." Marion laughed softly. "It could be." One evening, as dusk fell over the half-built neighborhood, Marion walked alone along the rows of homes. Somewhere behind her, the city hummed, faintly, streetlights flickering on car horns distant. She paused at one newly finished porch, the wood still smelling of fresh pine. On the railing sat a small bronze plaque, newly installed in memory of Julian Cole, whose belief in people built this place. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her vision blurred, the words swimming before her eyes. Then she whispered in the fading light, "You're home now, my boy." Spring returned, gentle and green. Marion had grown thinner, but not weaker. The work had filled her life in ways she hadn't expected, not with glory, but with belonging. The foundation flourished under Renee's direction. James Ever Watchful had taken on a new project with the city. Dr. Bennett had retired, though he still visited for Sunday tea. They had become her chosen family survivors of the same storm. One Sunday, as the four of them sat around the table in the garden, Renee asked softly, "Do you ever miss it, the old house, the way it was before everything?" Marion looked up at the canopy of new leaves, sunlight flickering through. "No," she said after a pause. "Houses change. People change. What I miss is the sound of laughter, but maybe it's starting to come back. And indeed, somewhere nearby, children's laughter echoed from the Harbor Home's playground. That evening, Marion wrote in her journal one last time, "Julian, I used to think love was a shield. Now I know it's a seed. It doesn't stop the storm, it just survives it. And when it grows again, it never grows alone." She closed the book, gently placed it on the desk, and looked toward the lake. The sunset was slow and deep, painting the horizon in gold and violet. The air smelled of spring, of new beginnings. Marion stood, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and turned off the light. The house settled around her, not in mourning this time, but in rest, a heartbeat continuing in the quiet. Outside, wind carried the sound of children's laughter through the open window, mingling with the soft rhythm of the lake against the shore. For the first time, she felt truly at peace. The storm had passed. What remained was life.